It was the last night of 2018, and I had just returned home from an exhausting shift at the hospital. The city was buzzing with excitement, everyone preparing to ring in the new year. I just finished a long stretch in the ER, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home to unwind before heading back to work in the morning. I lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of town, in a small one-story house. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors during the day. But tonight, something felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the neighborhood seemed unusually still. I shrugged it off, though. Maybe it was just the fatigue setting in. I locked the door behind me as I entered and kicked off my shoes. The only sound was the hum of the fridge and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, sank into the couch, and flipped through channels on the TV. Outside, fireworks began to light up the sky, signaling the start of the new year. Around 12 a.m., as the fireworks erupted, I heard a soft sound, almost like a tap on the window. I froze, turning the volume on the TV down, trying to listen for anything else. Nothing. It was probably just the wind, I thought. But then I heard it again, louder this time, coming from the back of the house. I felt my pulse quicken. I told myself it was probably some kids messing around, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping in. I stood up and grabbed a small metal flashlight from the drawer in the kitchen. With a deep breath, I quietly moved through the house, heading for the back door. As I neared the kitchen, I noticed that the back door was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat. I was sure I'd locked it when I came in. The door wasn't wide open, just enough to make me nervous. I could feel the weight of the air around me, heavy with tension. I stepped back cautiously and pulled out my phone, calling 911. As I waited, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps in the back hall, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying to move quietly. The 911 dispatcher picked up, and I whispered into the phone, "There's someone in my house." I could hear her voice immediately shifting to that calm, urgent tone as she asked for my address. I kept my eyes on the hallway, praying that the intruder wouldn't hear me. The footsteps got closer, and then, just as I was about to back into the living room, I saw him, a man standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a mask. My stomach dropped. We froze, staring at each other for what felt like an eternity. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. His hand went to the back of his pants as he stepped into the kitchen. I could hear the faint jingle of something metallic. "Get on the ground," he said, his voice cold and low. He had a gun. It was pointed at me. I obeyed. My heart was pounding in my chest as I lowered myself to the floor. My mind was racing. What did he want? What could I do to survive this? I couldn't just lie there and wait for him to take everything. "Don't do anything stupid," the man said, his eyes scanning the room, looking for something. "Where's the cash?" "I don't have any cash," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't keep cash in the house." "Bullshit," he snapped. "Don't lie to me." My breath caught in my throat as he moved closer, stepping over my body as if I was nothing more than an inconvenience. His gun was still pointed at me, but he wasn't focused on me anymore. He was checking drawers, opening cabinets. I tried to calm myself. The dispatcher was still on the line, and I could hear her talking to me through the phone, asking for more details, but I had to be careful not to make any noise. I could hear the sirens faintly in the distance. They were coming, but I had no idea how much time I had left. As the man rifled through the house, I slowly inched my hand toward the small kitchen drawer where I kept a can of pepper spray. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I couldn't let this man leave without a fight. Finally, I felt it in my hand. The can was small and light, and I prayed that I could use it before he noticed. My body was trembling with fear as I prepared to act. I just had to wait for the right moment. Then the man cursed. He found what he was looking for, a small jewelry box in one of the cabinets. He smiled to himself and pocketed it, but as he turned to leave, he made one mistake. He turned his back to me. I lunged. I sprayed the pepper spray directly into his face, and his reaction was immediate. He screamed in pain, stumbling backward, dropping the gun. I didn't wait for him to recover. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the gun, pointing it at him. "Stay where you are," I shouted, but my voice was shaky. The man didn't argue. His hands went up in the air as he backed toward the door. I could hear the sirens now, closer. Within moments, the front door burst open, and police officers rushed inside. They quickly apprehended the man, who was still struggling to see through his burning eyes. As they cuffed him, I sank to the floor, my body finally releasing the tension that had been building up for what felt like hours. That New Year's Eve, I was lucky. I survived without injury, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he stood over me, or the feeling of being completely powerless in my own home. New Year's Eve in a rural town isn't exactly exciting. That year, I decided to skip the parties and spend the evening dog-sitting for a family friend, Mr. Hawthorne, who lived about 20 miles out of town. His house was isolated, surrounded by nothing but open fields and the occasional clump of trees. He was visiting his daughter for the holidays and needed someone to watch his German Shepherd, Duke. I didn't mind. Duke was friendly and the pay was good. Plus, the idea of ringing in the new year with a quiet evening and a loyal dog sounded appealing. When I arrived at the house around 7 p.m., the snow was already falling heavily. The wind whistled through the empty fields, and the sky was a deep, overcast gray. Mr. Hawthorne's house was a modest one-story structure, cozy but clearly aged. Duke greeted me at the door with a wagging tail, and I settled in for the night. The first few hours were uneventful. I watched some TV, played fetch with Duke in the living room, and made myself a cup of tea. By 10 p.m., the snowstorm outside had intensified. The wind howled, and the windows rattled as the temperature dropped. I double-checked the doors to make sure everything was locked and pulled the curtains shut, trying to block out the eerie emptiness outside. Around 10:30, Duke started acting strange. He'd been lying near my feet, but suddenly, his ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "What is it, boy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He stood up, his body tense, and stared at the front door. I walked over and peeked through the peephole, but all I saw was swirling snow. The porch light barely illuminated the driveway, and beyond that was pure darkness. "Probably just the wind," I said, more to myself than to Duke, but he didn't relax. For the next half hour, he kept pacing between the front door and the back of the house, growling intermittently. It was starting to unnerve me. At 11:15, I heard it, a faint knock at the back door. I froze. It wasn't loud or forceful, but it was deliberate. Someone was out there. My first thought was to ignore it, but then the knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Hawthorne, hoping he might have a logical explanation. "Hey, Mr. Hawthorne, it's me. Did you tell anyone to stop by tonight?" "No," he replied, sounding confused. "Why?" "There's someone knocking at the back door." There was a pause. "Nobody should be out there, especially in this weather," he said firmly. "Don't open the door. Call the sheriff if they don't leave." After hanging up, I crept to the back of the house, keeping the lights off. The knocking had stopped, but Duke was at the door, barking furiously now. I peered through the small window above the sink and saw nothing but snow. Then I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, leading up to the back door from the field behind the house. The odd thing was, there were no prints leading away. My stomach dropped. Whoever it was hadn't left. I grabbed the house phone and dialed the sheriff's office. They assured me they'd send someone, but the storm was slowing everything down. It might be a while. As I hung up, I heard a loud thud from the side of the house. It sounded like something or someone had hit the wall. Duke went wild, barking and growling, his hackles raised. My heart was racing now. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and cautiously made my way to the living room. That's when I saw the shadow. It moved past the window, barely visible through the curtain. Someone was walking around the house, circling it slowly. I turned off all the lights and crouched down, trying to stay out of sight. Duke stayed by my side, his growls low but constant. For the next 15 minutes, I heard movement outside, footsteps crunching in the snow, the occasional tap on a window, and once, what sounded like muffled laughter. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of the sheriff's cruiser coming up the driveway. Relief washed over me as two deputies stepped out and began shining their flashlights around the property. They found the footprints, but whoever had been out there was gone. The tracks led to the edge of the field and disappeared into the woods. The deputies stayed for about an hour, patrolling the area and checking the house. They didn't find anything else, but they promised to keep an eye on the property for the rest of the night. After they left, I locked every door and window again, then sat on the couch with Duke, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. Midnight came and went, but I couldn't bring myself to celebrate. Instead, I sat there in silence, listening to the wind howl and watching the snow pile up outside. I never found out who was out there or what they wanted, but the thought of those footprints, coming up to the door and never leaving, still gives me chills to this day. It was the night of December 31st, and I was more than ready to say goodbye to the past year. I had been working nonstop at a high-pressure job, and a quiet evening with some drinks and my closest friends seemed like the perfect way to start fresh. We were at a small house party in the suburbs, just far enough from the downtown area to avoid the chaos of the bigger celebrations. By the time the clock ticked past midnight, the excitement was fading, and most of the guests had started to head home. My best friend, Kate, and I had decided to leave the party early. Both of us were exhausted and needed to get some rest before returning to the grind the next day. We were both living in different parts of the city, and I had offered to give her a ride home, since I knew she didn't want to deal with the hassle of a cab or rideshare. We walked out into the cold night air, and I started my car, ready to head down the nearly empty streets. The city's usual hustle and bustle had died down, and everything felt still, almost too still. We spoke in half-hearted conversation as I drove, both of us too tired to really keep up a lively chat. The streets, usually lit and vibrant, were dark, and the only sounds we could hear were the faint hum of the engine and the distant sounds of New Year's celebrations in the distance. I turned onto a quieter, more residential road to avoid traffic, and that's when I noticed something strange. A car was following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were heading in the same direction, or maybe they had just turned out from one of the side streets. But as I made a few turns, the car stayed right behind me, maintaining the same distance. It wasn't speeding up or slowing down, just matching my pace. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. It was probably just someone going the same way. I kept driving, but the car followed. It wasn't until I turned down a side street near Kate's place that the car's headlights seemed to flare up, almost blinding me in the rearview mirror. "Are you sure it's okay?" Kate asked, sensing my growing discomfort. "Yeah, it's probably nothing," I replied, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to. I made a few more turns, trying to lose the car, but it stuck with me. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I could feel my pulse quickening. Kate had gone quiet, her gaze fixed out the window, clearly picking up on the weird tension in the air. The streets were even quieter now, and I could hear the sound of the car's engine behind me. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. It was too dark to see much, but I thought I caught a glimpse of someone in the driver's seat, their face hidden in shadow. It didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Kate asked again, her voice now laced with concern. I nodded, though I was starting to feel like we weren't just being followed for no reason. I wasn't sure why they were behind me, but the thought of losing them by pulling into Kate's driveway felt like the safest bet. I accelerated a little, trying to make a quick turn onto her street, but the car behind me did the same. At this point, I knew it wasn't just some random person driving behind us. The last thing I wanted was for Kate to panic, but I could feel my anxiety rising. I didn't know if this was a coincidence or if something was actually wrong, but I couldn't ignore the fear creeping up my spine. I didn't want to stop in a quiet neighborhood with no one around. I needed a plan, and fast. Listen, I said, trying to sound calm. I'm going to pull over here. When I do, I want you to get out of the car as quickly as you can and go to that 24-hour convenience store. I'll drive around the block and come back to pick you up. Kate's eyes widened, but she didn't argue. She nodded, clutching her purse tightly in her lap. I slowed the car and pulled off to the side of the street, pretending to check my phone. As soon as I did, the car behind me slowed as well, coming to a stop just a few feet behind my car. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. In a split second, I made the decision to go through with the plan. Go, I whispered. Kate quickly unbuckled her seatbelt and grabbed her bag, opening the door just wide enough to slip out. As soon as she was out of the car, I immediately drove off, circling the block and trying to keep a safe distance from the car following us. I was careful to keep an eye on the rearview mirror, but the car stayed at a distance, following me as I made my way down the winding roads. After a few minutes, I looped back around and saw Kate standing at the convenience store entrance, looking toward the road. I quickly pulled into the parking lot and rushed over to her. She hopped in without saying a word, but I could tell she was just as shaken up as I was. We didn't speak much after that. The car had disappeared after I had made the final turn, and we were left with only our thoughts to consider. The rest of the drive was quiet, but the tension in the air didn't leave us. I dropped Kate off at her place, and she thanked me before quickly heading inside. I didn't want to drive home just yet, but I didn't have much of a choice. I felt an odd sense of relief that the car hadn't followed me home, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, checking the locks on my doors repeatedly, unsure of what had just happened, but thankful it hadn't escalated further. Looking back, I don't know who that person was or why they followed us, but that night, it was clear. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't the ones that make noise or draw attention. It's the quiet, persistent things that stay in the background, waiting for you to let your guard down. It was New Year's Eve, and I had promised my coworker Sam I'd help him out. His car had broken down, and he needed someone to drive him to a cabin about 30 miles outside of town. He claimed it was urgent, though he didn't explain why. "Just pick me up at my place at 8, Sam had said. "It won't take long." I didn't have any big plans, so I agreed. The roads were slick with ice and snow was coming down hard, but the drive wasn't too bad at first. Sam was unusually quiet, clutching a large duffel bag on his lap. "What's in the bag?" I finally asked, trying to break the tension. "Tools," he said, avoiding my gaze. "What kind of tools?" "You'll see," he muttered. The longer we drove, the more uneasy I felt. Sam wasn't usually this secretive. I noticed he kept glancing at his phone, like he was waiting for a message. "You sure this cabin's safe to get to in this weather?" I asked. "It's fine," he said a little too quickly. By the time we reached the turnoff, the road had narrowed into a single-lane path surrounded by dense forest. My headlights barely cut through the swirling snow. "Almost there," Sam said, sitting up straighter. I didn't respond. Something about this whole trip felt off. The cabin finally came into view, a small, weathered building barely visible through the trees. "Wait here," Sam said, grabbing the duffel bag and stepping out. "I'll only be a few minutes." I watched him disappear inside the cabin, the door creaking shut behind him. The seconds dragged on. 10 minutes, 15, 20. I was debating whether to go check on him when the cabin door burst open. Sam stumbled out, his face pale, the duffel bag still clutched in his hands. "Drive!" he shouted, running toward the car. "What's going on?" I yelled as he threw open the passenger door. "Just drive." I didn't ask questions. I threw the car into gear and tore down the icy road, my tires slipping and skidding. My heart pounded as Sam sat beside me, clutching the bag like his life depended on it. We didn't stop until we were back in town. I pulled into a gas station parking lot, shaking with adrenaline. "Sam, what the hell was that?" I demanded. "Nothing you need to worry about," he muttered, stepping out of the car with the duffel bag. "Sam!" I called after him, but he didn't look back. The next morning, I saw a news report. Police investigating break-in at remote cabin, suspect arrested. Sam had been caught. A few days later, I got a call from the police. "We'd like to ask you some questions about your involvement with Samuel Harris," the officer said. "Involvement?" I stammered. "He mentioned that you drove him to the cabin," the officer continued, "but also clarified that you were unaware of his intentions. Can you confirm this?" I was stunned. Sam had confessed but spared me by telling the truth. I agreed to meet with the police to explain everything. At the station, they asked me about the trip, how I knew Sam, why I agreed to drive him, and whether I suspected anything unusual. I recounted everything: the strange duffel bag, Sam's nervous behavior, and how he claimed the trip was urgent. "You didn't think to question why he needed a ride to a remote cabin in a snowstorm?" the officer asked, raising an eyebrow. I hesitated. I thought it was weird, but I trusted him. I didn't know he was planning anything illegal. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "It matches what he told us. You're not in trouble, but we might contact you again if we need further clarification." Sam ended up getting charged for the break-in and theft. According to the news reports, he targeted the cabin because he believed the owner owed him money. This wasn't his first crime, but it was the first time he'd been caught. Although I wasn't charged, the experience haunted me. People at work whispered about me, even after I explained the situation. That New Year's Eve taught me a hard lesson. Some favors aren't worth the risk. Now, I think twice before agreeing to anything, especially when someone's being secretive. That New Year's Eve, I wasn't planning to do anything special. My parents were out of town, so I stayed at their house to keep an eye on things while they visited my sister in Denver. I didn't mind. The house was comfortable and the rural neighborhood was quiet. The night started peacefully. I ordered pizza, played some music, and thought about catching up on a true crime documentary series. Around 8 p.m., I took their dog, Max, outside for a quick walk around the yard. It had snowed earlier, and everything looked clean and untouched under the moonlight. As I rounded the corner near the old garden shed, Max froze. His ears perked up, and he let out a low, rumbling growl. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, tugging gently on his leash. He wouldn't budge. His eyes were locked on the shed, which sat at the edge of the property near the woods. The shed was mostly used for storing gardening tools and bags of mulch. My dad hadn't mentioned anything about it when I agreed to house sit. I squinted at it, trying to see what Max was reacting to, but there was nothing unusual, just a dark, snow-covered structure. "Come on," I said, pulling him back toward the house. Max finally relented, but he kept glancing over his shoulder at the shed as we went inside. I locked the door behind us, gave Max a treat, and tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was probably a rabbit or a raccoon, but the way Max had acted stuck with me. Around 10 p.m., I was halfway through the second episode of my show when Max growled again. This time, he was standing by the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. His fur bristled, and his growl was louder, more intense. My stomach knotted as I turned off the TV and looked outside. The yard was dark, but the moonlight reflected off the snow, giving just enough visibility. I saw footprints leading from the edge of the woods to the garden shed. I hadn't noticed them earlier. I grabbed my phone and called my dad. "Did you leave anything in the shed? Or has anyone been by the house recently?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "No," he said, sounding confused. "Why?" I told him about the footprints and how Max was acting. "Call the police," he said immediately. "Don't check it yourself. Just call." I hung up and dialed 911. The dispatcher assured me an officer would be there soon and told me to stay inside. While I waited, I couldn't stop staring at the shed. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a homeless person seeking shelter? A petty thief? The officer arrived about 15 minutes later. I met him at the front door and explained everything. He nodded and asked me to stay inside while he checked it out. I watched from the window as he approached the shed, flashlight in hand. He opened the door cautiously, peering inside. After a moment, he stepped back and spoke into his radio. Then I saw him gently coax someone out of the shed. A man, disheveled and thin, wearing several layers of mismatched clothing. He looked more scared than dangerous. The officer later explained that the man was a homeless drifter who had been trying to escape the freezing temperatures. He'd found the shed unlocked and decided to sleep there for the night. Inside, they found nothing but a ratty sleeping bag and a small bundle of personal belongings. The man was taken to a shelter in town, and the officer assured me he wasn't a threat. Still, the experience left me rattled. The idea of someone being so close to the house, so close to me, without my knowing was deeply unsettling. That New Year's Eve taught me to always lock the doors, no matter how quiet the neighborhood seems.